In the grand, often tragic theater of the 20th century, nations are forged and shattered by the titanic forces of ideology, war, and revolution. Yet within this sweeping historical drama, the prosperity or ruin of a country can sometimes hinge on the iron will and personal convictions of a single individual. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was such a nation, and its architect, Marshal Josip Broz Tito, was such a man. For nearly half a century, he was the indispensable force that held together a volatile tapestry of peoples: Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, and Montenegrins, a nation divided by ethnicity, language, and the deep historical scars of Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, and Islam. Tito guided this complex federation through an era of unprecedented development and international prestige. But the very confidence that allowed Tito to perform such miracles also contained the seeds of conflict. His unwavering belief in Yugoslavia's unique destiny set it on a collision course not only with its own internal demons, but with the monolithic power that sought to dominate the entire communist world, the Soviet Union, under the absolute rule of Joseph Stalin. This was not a simple political disagreement. It was profound ideological and personal rupture, a clash of titans that would transform two allied socialist states into bitter adversaries, each viewing the other as a heretical threat. It was a family feud on a global scale, a story of brotherhood turned to betrayal. What irreconcilable differences could drive such a deep wedge between Marshal Tito and Generalissimo Stalin, two men who had fought on the same side against the ultimate evil of fascism? How did a shared ideology become the very battlefield upon which they waged their Cold War? To understand this monumental schism, we must journey back to the crucible where their relationship was first forged and tested, the blood-soaked battlefields of World War II.
When the flames of World War II engulfed Europe, Yugoslavia was not merely conquered, it was systematically dismantled and plunged into a multi-layered nightmare. The Axis invasion of April 1941 was swift and brutal. The Royal Yugoslav government collapsed in a matter of days, its monarchy fleeing into exile. But this was only the beginning. The country was carved up by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Worse still, the invaders skillfully exploited the region's latent ethnic and religious hatreds, turning neighbor against neighbor in a horrific civil war. The Nazi-backed Ustaše regime in the independent state of Croatia launched a genocidal campaign against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. In response, Serbian royalists, known as the Chetniks, fought against the occupiers, but also engaged in brutal ethnic cleansing against Croats and Muslims. Yugoslavia was tearing itself apart. Into this maelstrom of chaos stepped Josip Broz Tito, the General Secretary of the then underground Communist Party of Yugoslavia. A veteran of the Bolshevik Revolution and a hardened Comintern agent, Tito was a figure of immense charisma, tactical brilliance, and steely determination. He surveyed the landscape of competing factions, the foreign occupiers, the collaborationist puppets, the feuding ethnic nationalists, and chose a path that seemed, at first glance, audacious to the point of suicidal, but in reality was the only one that could lead to true victory. His strategy was revolutionary. He would build a resistance movement, the Partisans, that was not dependent on foreign patrons. He would not be a pawn of London, like the Chetniks, nor would he wait for orders from Moscow. His appeal would be forged in the one unifying sentiment that could transcend ethnic and religious divides, a pure, unadulterated hatred for the foreign invaders. He offered a vision not of a greater Serbia or a pure Croatia, but of a liberated, unified Yugoslavia, where all its peoples could live as equals in a new socialist brotherhood. This grassroots approach, built on the promise of both national liberation and social revolution, gave the Partisans a legitimacy that no other faction could claim. As Tito himself would later remark, the Partisans had to fight a war on two fronts, one against the fascist occupiers and another against the domestic traitors and chauvinists who sought to divide the nation. For years, the partisans fought a lonely, brutal guerrilla war, pinning down dozens of Axis divisions in the treacherous Balkan mountains. Initially, Moscow's support was non-existent. Stalin, bound by his non-aggression pact with Hitler, had ordered communist parties to stand down. Even after the German invasion of the USSR, Stalin's attention was fixed on his own desperate struggle for survival. He offered Tito little more than encouraging rhetoric. But as the war turned and the partisans grew into a formidable fighting force, the most effective resistance movement in occupied Europe, Stalin could no longer ignore them. The Soviet Union began to provide crucial aid, military advisors, weapons, and air support. An alliance of convenience was born. For Tito, Soviet aid was a welcome necessity. For Stalin, the partisans were a valuable asset in tying down German forces and ensuring a communist foothold in the Balkans. It was a relationship that mirrored, in some ways, the future dynamic between Vietnam and China during their wars of liberation. A partnership between a junior and senior brother, bound by a common enemy, but with inherently unequal power.
In Tito's eyes, Stalin was a revered comrade, the leader of the world's first socialist state. But Tito was nobody's subordinate. The first cracks in this fraternal facade appeared almost as soon as liberation was in sight. On September 28, 1944, with the tide of war having decisively turned, Tito granted the Red Army permission to enter northeastern Yugoslavia to aid in the final push. Together, the partisans and the Soviets launched a massive offensive, culminating in the liberation of the capital, Belgrade. The city's inhabitants welcomed the Red Army soldiers as heroes. However, the gratitude was short-lived. Even as the fighting raged, Stalin's intentions became clear. The Soviet Union immediately began inserting intelligence agents into the fabric of the newly liberated Yugoslav state, seeking to build a network of influence and control. Stalin saw Eastern Europe not as a collection of sovereign allies, but as a strategic buffer zone, a sphere of influence to be dominated by Moscow. And in this sphere, Yugoslavia, with its powerful battle-hardened army and popular leader, was both the crown jewel and the most dangerous variable. Tito, with his rich life experience, sharp political instincts, and unwavering resolve, would not allow the nation he had bled for to become a vassal state. He had not driven out the German fascists only to subordinate Yugoslav sovereignty to any other foreign power, even a brotherly one. In an act of breathtaking audacity, almost immediately after the German withdrawal, Tito made a stunning demand. All foreign military forces, including the celebrated Red Army, must leave Yugoslav territory. Across Europe, governments were beholden to the Allied armies that had liberated them. No other leader, especially in the East, would have dared to issue such an ultimatum to Moscow while the war was still technically ongoing. It was a clear declaration of independence. From this moment, the seeds of suspicion between Tito and Stalin began to germinate, nurtured by their fundamentally different visions for the future. The friction intensified over the issue of Trieste, a strategic port city on the Adriatic with a mixed Italian and Slovene population. Yugoslav partisans had fought hard and liberated the city, considering it historically part of their lands. But Stalin, honoring a wartime agreement with the Western Allies that placed the city in their sphere of influence, coldly ordered Tito to withdraw his troops. For Tito, who had just shed Yugoslav blood for the city, this was a profound humiliation. His nation's interests and sacrifices were being casually traded away on the grand chessboard of the great powers. With his country exhausted by war and his army still consolidating, Tito had no choice but to comply. He swallowed his pride, but he would never forget the bitter taste of this betrayal. It was the first open wound in a relationship that would soon hemorrhage.
With the war over, Yugoslavia faced the monumental task of rebuilding a country that had been physically and spiritually shattered. 1 in 10 of its citizens had perished. Its infrastructure was in ruins, and the ethnic hatreds fanned by the war still simmered beneath the surface. Tito's new government had to both reconstruct the nation and unify its deeply divided peoples. Having won the war largely through his own efforts, Tito entered peacetime with the same fiercely independent mindset. He believed he could forge a new destiny for Yugoslavia, regardless of the opinions of the great powers in the East or West. He envisioned a path to socialism that was uniquely Yugoslav, one that fused Marxist-Leninist principles with a potent strain of national pride. The central theme of his government was brotherhood and unity, a constant refrain aimed at healing the wounds of the Civil War and building a shared national identity. This independent streak quickly brought Yugoslavia into conflict with the West. Tito's government was unapologetically communist, and its territorial claims against Italy kept tensions high. The post-war period was marked by a series of military confrontations, the most serious of which saw the Yugoslav Air Force shoot down at least 4 American military aircraft between 1945 and 1948, creating a diplomatic crisis that brought the two sides to the brink of open conflict. Even Stalin grew alarmed at Tito's aggressive posture, fearing that his reckless protege might drag the entire Soviet bloc into a premature war with the United States. Yet Tito was a pragmatist, not a dogmatist. He understood that the capitalist powers, with their centuries of industrial development and vast resources, could be vital partners in Yugoslavia's reconstruction, provided the relationship was based on mutual respect and equality. In a gesture of goodwill aimed at placating the West and the powerful Catholic Church, he commuted the sentence of Archbishop Aloysius Stepinac. Stepinac had been convicted of collaborating with the fascist Ustaše regime, a charge that infuriated the Vatican. By moving him from prison to house arrest and eventually allowing him to leave the country, Tito sent a powerful signal. It demonstrated that Yugoslavia was different from the other hardline communist states of Eastern Europe. It was a regime willing to be flexible, to engage, and to compromise. This independent foreign policy, doing what he believed was best for Yugoslavia, rather than adhering to a rigid ideological script dictated from abroad, was precisely what infuriated the masters of the Kremlin. Stalin could not comprehend, let alone tolerate, such defiance. In his worldview, the communist movement was a monolithic army, and he was its supreme commander. The nations of Eastern Europe were to be obedient satellites, their economies and policies molded in the Soviet image. They were expected to adopt the Soviet model of a command economy, erect their own iron curtains, and purge any hint of Western influence.
Tito, however, refused to accept this one-size-fits-all prescription. He rejected Stalin's proposal to merge Yugoslavia into a federation with Bulgaria, seeing it as a transparent ploy to dilute Yugoslav sovereignty and bring him under Moscow's thumb. He pioneered his own economic model, one tailored to Yugoslavia's specific social conditions. This Yugoslav way yielded impressive results. In the immediate post-war years, the Yugoslav economy recovered and grew at a pace that outstripped many of its Eastern European neighbors, and in some sectors, even the Soviet Union itself. This success, far from earning praise from Moscow, was seen as an ideological challenge. It was an implicit criticism of the Soviet model. Stalin's ambition demanded conformity. He wanted Yugoslavia to implement the harsh dictates of the dictatorship of the proletariat, to build an impenetrable wall against the West, and to follow the economic blueprint laid out by Moscow. To be fair, the Soviet model that Stalin sought to impose was not without its merits, especially in the context of post-war devastation. It had transformed a backward feudal Russia into an industrial superpower capable of defeating the Nazi war machine. It provided universal health care, free education, and unprecedented rights for women. Life might not have been prosperous, but for the vast majority it offered a basic level of security, a roof over one's head, and food on the table. But the model was also deeply flawed, characterized by brutal repression, the absence of basic freedoms, and a stifling bureaucracy that crushed innovation. Most importantly for Stalin, he felt Yugoslavia had no need for direct relations with the West. Why court capitalist powers when it had the friendship and support of the entire socialist world, led by the mighty Soviet Union? If dialogue with Washington or London was necessary, Moscow would handle it, just as it did for Poland, Hungary, and its other satellites. For a man of Tito's pride and proven capability, this was an intolerable proposition. He had not led a victorious national liberation struggle to become a colonial governor for the Kremlin. He was the leader of a sovereign nation, an equal partner, not a subordinate. The stage was set for a clash, not just of policies, but of personalities, two of the most formidable and unyielding figures of the 20th century.
To compare the leader of a medium-sized Balkan nation to the absolute ruler of a burgeoning superpower might seem imbalanced. Yet in terms of sheer willpower and audacity, Tito and Stalin were more than a match for one another. They were, as the saying goes, cut from the same cloth. Hardened revolutionaries who had clawed their way to absolute power and would not suffer any challenge to their authority. The confrontation escalated through a series of increasingly bold acts of defiance by Tito. When Yugoslavia and neighboring Albania signed a treaty of economic and military unification, effectively making Albania a Yugoslav economic dependency, Stalin was left to read about it in the newspapers. It was a minor event in the grand scheme of things, but the message was thunderous. Tito had conducted foreign policy as a sovereign power without consulting or even informing his supposed senior partner in Moscow. The insult was deliberate and keenly felt in the Kremlin. As if to twist the knife, Tito followed this up by signing a similar treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with Bulgaria, again without seeking Moscow's blessing. These were not the actions of a satellite leader. They were the actions of a regional power broker building his own sphere of influence in the Balkans. Tito was signaling that he stood on equal footing with Stalin, that he would not bow or scrape for approval. He had fought and defeated the Third Reich on his own terms. He would not now become a lackey for the Red Tsar. The final straw came during the Greek Civil War, 1946 to 1949. Stalin, in a secret wartime meeting with Winston Churchill, had informally agreed to the Percentages Agreement, which consigned Greece to the Western sphere of influence. In exchange, the USSR was given dominance over Romania and Bulgaria. Stalin, a ruthless pragmatist, intended to honor this backroom deal to avoid a direct confrontation with the West at a time when the Cold War was just beginning. He explicitly ordered Tito to cease all aid to the Greek communist guerrillas. This was a direct command, and Tito openly disobeyed it. He saw the Greek communists as ideological brethren and a potential ally in his vision of a Balkan federation. He continued to funnel weapons and supplies across the border, defying Stalin and risking a wider war. From Stalin's perspective, this was the ultimate act of insubordination. Tito was not just an annoyance, he was a rogue agent, a loose cannon who threatened the entire strategic calculus of the Soviet bloc. In the paranoid world of Joseph Stalin, independence was indistinguishable from treason. The break was now inevitable, and when it came, it was absolute. In 1948, Yugoslavia was formally expelled from the Cominform, the Soviet-led international organization of communist parties. A vicious propaganda campaign was unleashed. Tito was denounced as a fascist, a Trotskyite, and an imperialist spy. Economic blockades were imposed, and Soviet-backed coup attempts were organized within Yugoslavia. The conflict then descended into the darkest shadows of espionage and assassination. Stalin, the master of political terror, dispatched teams of assassins to eliminate his defiant Balkan rival. But Tito, a seasoned conspirator himself, had built a formidable security apparatus. The plots failed, one after another. What followed was perhaps the most audacious act of Tito's entire career. He sent a short, chilling letter directly to Stalin. The message read, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second. In the entire history of Stalin's bloody reign, it is doubtful that any foreign leader had ever dared to threaten him so personally and so bluntly. It was a threat from one killer to another, a message delivered in the only language Stalin truly understood: naked force. Whether the letter was the sole reason or not, the assassination attempts ceased. But the relationship between the two nations was frozen solid. Soviet military plans were even drawn up for a full-scale invasion of Yugoslavia to be launched in concert with Hungary and other satellite states. Only the outbreak of the Korean War and the escalating global confrontation with the United States forced the plan to be shelved indefinitely. The Communist brothers were now mortal enemies.
The Tito-Stalin split created a fascinating real-world experiment. Two nations, both claiming to be building socialism, but taking dramatically different paths to get there. The Soviet Union continued along the path Stalin had established. It was a society defined by a centrally planned, top-down command economy. Every aspect of production was dictated by 5-year plans devised in Moscow. A vast, pervasive secret police, the KGB, monitored every facet of public and private life, ensuring absolute political conformity. As noted, this model had achieved remarkable feats, particularly in rapid industrialization. In the years after World War II, a nation that had lost over 25 million people and seen its western half reduced to rubble performed an economic miracle. By 1950, its industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels by 73%. The Soviet Union became the world's second superpower, a leader in science and technology, capable of challenging the United States across the globe. Yugoslavia, however, embarked on a radical new course. Politically, it remained a one-party state under the firm control of the Communist Party. But economically, especially after the 1948 break, it began to innovate in ways that were unthinkable elsewhere in the communist world. On June 26, 1950, the National Assembly passed a landmark law, championed by Tito and his top ideologue Milovan Đilas, introducing a policy of self-management, also known as worker self-management. This was a unique form of market socialism. While industries remained socially owned rather than privately owned, they were not directly run by the state. Instead, they were managed by the workers themselves through democratically elected workers' councils. These councils made decisions about production, investment, and, crucially, the distribution of profits. This introduced market competition and a profit motive, creating powerful incentives for efficiency and innovation that were absent in the rigid Soviet system. The reforms went further. In 1963, the country was renamed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and a new constitution was enacted that further decentralized power. The government relaxed its grip on society, allowing for greater freedom of speech, easing restrictions on religion, and permitting private investment in small-scale enterprises. Most remarkably, Yugoslavia opened its borders. Its citizens could travel freely to the West to work or as tourists, and Westerners could visit Yugoslavia, bringing with them foreign currency and foreign ideas.
Aided by significant financial assistance from the West, which saw Tito as a valuable cudgel against the USSR, the Yugoslav economy boomed. The number of industrial jobs doubled between 1950 and 1964. Unemployment fell to just 6% by 1961. Real wages grew at an average of 6.2% per year, while industrial output soared by nearly 13% annually. These were staggering, world-leading figures. Yugoslavia became a significant exporter of industrial goods, from heavy machinery and transport equipment to advanced naval ships and defense technology. By the early 1980s, its GDP growth averaged a remarkable 6.1% per year. Living standards rose dramatically. Literacy reached 91%. Healthcare was free and universal, and life expectancy climbed to 72 years, a figure comparable to many Western nations. Crucially, because it was not locked behind the Iron Curtain, Yugoslavia could trade with the entire world. Its companies built major infrastructure projects in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. It was a nation that belonged to neither bloc, a bridge between East and West. Tito's greatest diplomatic achievement, the ultimate expression of his break with Stalin, was the creation of the non-aligned movement. In 1961, together with the leaders of India, Egypt, Indonesia, and Ghana, Tito co-founded a global movement of nations that refused to take sides in the Cold War. This was not a passive policy of neutrality, it was an active and assertive third way. The NAM gave a collective voice to the newly independent and developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, allowing them to resist the pressures of the American and Soviet superpowers. In 1961, at the movement's first summit in Belgrade, Tito was elected its first Secretary General. This role catapulted him from a Balkan leader to a global statesman. He was a unique figure on the world stage, welcomed in Washington, feted in Moscow after Stalin's death and a subsequent thaw in relations, and revered as a hero across the developing world. This international standing was underpinned by Yugoslavia's growing economic and military strength. To guarantee its hard-won independence, Tito's government embarked on its most secret and ambitious project, a program to develop nuclear weapons. Confidential documents reveal that the idea took root immediately after World War II. With quiet cooperation from the United States, Yugoslavia began sending its brightest young scientists to study nuclear physics at American universities. The program was paused in the 1960s due to cost and a desire for international respectability. But after India conducted its first nuclear test in 1974, a deeply alarmed Tito ordered the weapons program to be restarted with maximum urgency. The goal was to build a small arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons, the ultimate deterrent against any potential invasion from East or West. However, as Tito's health began to fail in the late 1970s, the project lost its primary champion. Without his personal authority to drive this nation-defining effort forward, the program languished and was eventually abandoned. It remains one of modern history's great what-ifs. Had Yugoslavia become a nuclear power, the tragic genocidal wars that tore it apart in the 1990s might never have happened.
The schism between Tito and Stalin stands as one of the most significant and fascinating chapters of the Cold War. It was a profound ideological tremor that sent shockwaves through the entire communist world, demonstrating for the first time that Moscow's authority was not absolute. It was a clash born of two irreconcilable visions: Stalin's demand for a monolithic, centrally controlled empire versus Tito's unwavering insistence on a sovereign, national path to socialism. If these two monumental figures had found a way to understand one another, to bridge the gap between their worldviews, history could have taken a very different course. The communist movement might have become more pluralistic and adaptable. Yugoslavia could have offered the Soviet bloc a viable model for market-based economic reform, perhaps averting its eventual economic stagnation and collapse. In return, the USSR could have provided Yugoslavia with the resources and security to solidify its unique experiment. But history does not deal in what-ifs. The confrontation reveals a timeless truth. In the final analysis, for a leader like Tito, the interests of his nation and his own hold on power would always trump ideological purity. The Tito-Stalin split was more than a political disagreement. It was a declaration that the right of a nation to determine its own destiny is an unconquerable force.